Okay, no intro to this one. I just want to get straight into a sober analysis of this Barcelona performance and why it was so underwhelming. This felt like the culmination of a few concerns of mine that have been bubbling under the surface, which we'll get to step by step during the course of this video. I'll start though with a speedy review of the first half and Inter's goal. It was, as I predicted in my tactical preview, a 3-4-3 from Xavi, and it was Marcos Alonso as a left wing-back. There were two big surprises though, with Sergio Roberto as a right centre-back, and Rafinha actually playing as an 8 in the left half space. I'll talk about both of those decisions later, but really in this game, this system was just a vehicle to ensure that Inter couldn't press. It gives your wide centre-backs comfortable possession, and you don't get outnumbered on the flanks like Barca did against Mallorca. I actually don't have an issue with the system positionally. The shape was just the foundation that allowed Barca to build up comfortably against Inter's 5-3-2. It was the execution though that was the problem. The first 20 minutes weren't disastrous and happened pretty much exactly as predicted in that preview. Inter definitely chose the defensive route, sat back, mostly allowing Barca's three centre-backs the ball, and when they won it back, Inter either struggled to play out or they went long and typically lost the duels with the Barca centre-backs. Although Barca failed to score from any of the turnovers, they got the wingers into reasonable positions and it felt as though it would come down to the right moment of quality. Fine so far. As the half went on though, Inter did get a bit more joy and found some flaws in Barca's press. The formula was quite simple and we talked about it before the game. You go direct to the centre forward, lay it off to the third man, and that unlocks the wing-backs who are out in space. And that's the risk with this man-to-man pressing system. Against a naturally wide team like Inter, who have both a wide 8 and a wing-back, you stretch yourself pretty thin, and losing any one of those duels or not fulfilling your pressing responsibility can open up the pitch like this. And while this literally only happened 3 times in the entire game, one of them just happened to be Inter's goal, which originated from one of these big switches of play. Even then though, the goal itself came after a deflected cross, and it was a pretty sensational hit. Inter had only 0.2 xG in this entire game, and fair play, they made it count. That's why I think it's wrong to focus too much on Barca's defending, especially considering their excellent record so far this season. The far greater concerns begin when we talk about what Barca could muster in their own possession, considering they had 72% of it, and we're going to spend the rest of this video talking about that. So what I'll cover is 3 issues in isolation, then explain what I think are the overriding problems behind them, and finally, of course, how to fix them. So let's start with the left flank. Playing Alonso as a wing-back and Rafinha in the half space had some serious drawbacks and were probably Xavi's biggest errors in this game. Rafinha just isn't comfortable in this position and a lot of the time wasn't aware of his offensive responsibility. It's fine for him to drop deep on occasion, but he did it too frequently and too early, meaning there was no threat in one of the most important zones, the space between wing-back and full-back. He also didn't attack the box nearly enough. You can see here with Dembélé on the ball, Pedri waves Rafinha forwards. But if he doesn't go, that leaves Lewandowski isolated as the only real target to hit. Are either of these things Rafinha's fault? Well, he's not a number 8 and it was a position that made no use of his 1v1 prowess or decisive passing from the right, so it's hard to blame him. To compound problems, the few occasions he timed the movement correctly in order to create space, Alonso didn't, or really couldn't, make any attempt to exploit it. Alonso's starting position was just not high enough in general, and that's because he's a fullback and not a winger. He obviously can't beat a man from a standing start, and against 5 at the back where the wing-backs are on top of you, you either need dynamic movement or the capability to dribble, neither of which he has, essentially offering nothing as a wide outlet. Pedri was also too reserved from his deeper role. Despite being Barca's only real creative spark and their best player, there were a couple of times he could have run into the space left behind by Rafinha but didn't. All this meant that the left side lacked any kind of rhythm, and that's problem number 1, rhythm. Players either didn't understand their responsibility or simply couldn't fulfill it, which led to indecision and impotence from the left. So on to problem number 2. Dembélé had more touches than Sergio Busquets in this game, 100 compared to 68, and while that seems ridiculous, I want to be pretty clear. It was not necessarily a mistake for Barca to attack the wide areas. Take a look at this Inter shape for a second. Where's the space? Unlike Mallorca or Eintracht Frankfurt, Inter play 3 in midfield with 2 forwards who were dropping very deep, meaning it couldn't be any more difficult really to attack the centre. so that isn't necessarily the problem. There's also nothing wrong with giving the ball to your most creative player. It's not a question of if you play it wide to Dembélé, but as Pep Guardiola likes to say, it's a question of when. And that when is dictated by his movement and the movement of those around him, of which there was simply not enough. Pause the game at pretty much any point in the second half and this is what you'd see. A rigid shape with Dembélé out wide, Gavi in the box somewhere, and Sergio Roberto supporting from behind, now as a right back in a 4-3-3. From here, usually the ball goes out wide to Dembélé, who gets doubled up on. He either tries to beat his men and put a cross in, or he goes back to Sergio Roberto, who then puts a cross in. There's no space creation using underlapping runs, virtually no variation where Dembélé might come inside and Roberto go outside, very little participation from Gavi in the half space. It's rigid, predictable, and extremely frustrating, because going back to that question of when to pass to Dembélé, well, there really isn't a good time, because either he's not moving enough or the players around him aren't moving enough. So you just end up in these 2 versus 1 situations over and over and over again. Does this excuse Dembélé for his 38 dispossessions and however many failed crosses? No, he performed poorly regardless of the circumstances. However, he could have been helped significantly by a more effective Sergio Roberto, who apparently forgot how to be an attacking right back, and by the team in general that was much too rigid. And this is problem number 2, a serious lack of fluidity. And the third issue is a direct follow-on from that, because not only was the team rigid, it was also too sluggish. When you're lacking rhythm and fluidity, you end up in a situation where the players on the ball don't have the right passing options around them. They receive it under pressure with no movement and no space to exploit. And that's how you end up with 50 crosses overall in the game. Yes, 50 crosses from Barca, because the players receive it and don't know what to do. Like here, as Alonso has no one attacking the left half space, he ends up just hopefully tossing the ball into the box. A lack of regular options ahead of the ball is only going to end up in slow build-up and slow decision-making. And that's problem number 3, dynamism. A lack of speed or energy in Barca's passing and movement. So now we have those 3 problems. A lack of rhythm, coming from players not fulfilling their individual roles. A lack of fluidity, players not understanding each other's roles and being able to rotate. And a lack of dynamism, not enough speed or quality in the passing and movement. And that allows us now to finally get to the point, which is the solution to this 3-pronged problem. And I'm going to put it as simply and plainly as possible. The answer is not to sack the coach, obviously. Xavi Hernandez is not a fraud. In fact, I believe he's a world-class manager. And all of those things I'm talking about, the rhythm, fluidity, and dynamism, were at the core of his philosophy last season, and what got me so excited about this project. However, what's missing this season, what ties all those principles together, is in the end quite simple, and that's relationships. Last season, for example, one of the pillars of Barca's turnaround was the relationship that bloomed on the left-hand side. That was between Jordi Alba, Ferran Torres and Pedri, although both Gavi and Frenkie de Jong were also very comfortable as that interior. Ferran's dynamic movement, plus Pedri's quality in the half space, plus Alba's passing quality from wide or deep, made for an excellent relationship. I found this passing move from one of Barca's best performances last season, away at Valencia. It starts with the ball out to Jordi Alba, who is pulled wide as Ferran comes inside. Ferran then drops deep and Frenkie pushes up to exploit the space. Alba passes inside to Ferran, who moves it onto Busquets. It's one touch from him into Frenkie, and another one-touch flick around the corner to Alba, who's run in behind. And it was a brilliant move, and this kind of combination is one that I can't remember seeing at all this season. I'm not saying these specific players are the answer, but there was a relationship here with profiles that complemented each other. Compare that to Barca's left flank in this game against Inter, and you can see that those relationships just don't exist. One more example from that Valencia game, this time on the right-hand side. It's a typical ball out to Dembélé, but here Dest has taken up an advanced position in the right half space, which enables a 1-2 with Dembélé. Meanwhile, Gavi makes a darting run across the box, exploiting the space created by Dest. Dembélé finds him with a first-time pass, and Gavi crosses for Aubameyang to score. Another brilliant passage of play that again was only possible due to the relationship and understanding between these 3 players. Rhythm, fluidity, and dynamism at its absolute best. This season, not only have we seen a big turnaround in personnel, but important players like Ferran and Alba from last season are underperforming. Plus there's injuries to guys like Frenkie de Jong and Koundé, who would both add a lot of dynamism to this team. So in the end, we haven't got to see any new blossoming relationships. Perhaps between Pedri and Lewandowski, but it's redundant if Pedri is playing this deep. So I could talk all day about potential systems to play against 5 at the back, inverted fullbacks, midfield squares, whatever. But this game was the real eye-opener for me, that we have to go back a step. And it's these principles, rhythm, fluidity and dynamism, tied together by relationships between players, that have to be the key going forward. I want to see the emphasis taken away from isolating individuals and back onto developing patterns. So it's up to the coach to do that, although it will be quite difficult in the short term because of all those injuries. So yes, Xavi made some serious errors in this game, but you have to see this as only the beginning of this project. No matter what happens in the next month, we've seen more than enough to be convinced that Barcelona, under this management, with the bulk of these players, can get back to the top. But it's going to need time and patience. You'd have thought we'd have learned that by now. Thanks for watching everyone, and I'll see you again next week.